Hi everyone, this is Jay again. Welcome back to our next video. And thank you to everybody who subscribed to our channel already. In the previous video, we covered the chemical structures of life and kind of just went over some of the content review. So in this video, I've created some basic questions that I think are reasonably indicative of how they'll test concepts on the AP exam. I would recommend that you try and find as many past AP biology tests as possible and do them leading up to your AP exam. But hopefully, if you're taking the class, this will give you some sort of an idea of the best way, the usual way that they like to test certain concepts. So really fast, let's go over some of the topics that I would recommend you study if you're reviewing for a test or even the AP biology exam for this unit. So chemical structures of life, some of the things we talked about in the last video, but I would recommend you understand the basic types of chemical bonds and their interactions. So that would be things like ionic bonds, covalent bonds, etc., and how they're essential to building things in life. You should know just, trans plus P, just know what that is, what these are the important elements used in life. Know the important properties of water, which we discussed in our last video, and most AP biology review books should cover this, but it's just really important to understand why life would not exist without water and why water is just so critical to every, living process. You should also understand the role of carbon, also mentioned in our last video. And for example, carbon skeletons is a very common type of, structural organization of certain biomolecules that's very common in living systems. So just kind of understand how carbon is fundamentally essential in anabolic processes. Functional groups, I think the most important thing for this is make sure you know how each of these influences like the polarity of a certain molecule. For example, you should know that having like an ionizable group, so having like a carboxylic acid group or an amine group that's charged will result in the molecule being polar. So that is why you'll notice that if you try and dissolve proteins in solution, many of them are soluble because of those groups. Building and breaking apart polymers, so I would just make sure you really understand how both dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis, how those two processes work and why they're essential when constructing and breaking down polymers. And then finally, types of macromolecules. I'm planning on having a separate video on this, but you should just kind of understand the fundamental basics of proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Now, with that being said, let's get started in working on some of our practice questions. So, the first question we're going to go over is related to types of chemical bonds and their interactions. And so typically most AP biology questions will give you a lot of information, and a lot of that is honestly because the test writers want to see how well you're able to manage your time. Most of the information they give you isn't really critical to answer the question. So I think that just by doing a lot of practice, that'll help you kind of understand a lot better what is the best way to break down the information in the easiest way possible, and what is the best way to understand what parts of this information do I need to actually answer the question. So let's read it. Let's look at this question here. So it says, a researcher is investigating the forces that govern protein stability. Her experiments reveal that when a protein is placed in an aqueous solution, polarity is the most important property that influences the stabilization process. So we know that polarity is going to be really important here. Actually, let me use a different color. So let's see. Most important property. And so it says, based on this information, which of the following would play the greatest role in protein stability? So glancing at the answer choices, we're kind of looking for what's the most important type of bond, force, interaction type of thing that plays the largest role in governing stability, and we know that polarity is the most important property. And so now let's look at the answer choices. So if we know polarity is the most important property, that kind of tells us that we know that the sort of bond or force that needs to be involved has to be related to polarity in some way. Now, what is polarity? If you remember, molecules like water or compounds like water are very polar because they have an uneven distribution of charge. And oil molecules are nonpolar because they have an equal distribution of charge. All right, now let's look at the answer choices. So our first answer choice is hydrophobic interactions. Now, this is kind of a common AP biology vocab term, and it's related to, if you might remember from taking hearing your teacher talk about it or hearing it in class, hydrophobic interactions has to do with the rearrangement of certain of the structural components of a certain compound when it's placed in a polar or nonpolar solution. So let's talk about, let's say, a protein. Like, let's say we have a certain peptide that's filled with both nonpolar and polar amino acids. And if we place it in a polar solution, so let's say water, because water is very polar, the polar components of the peptide chain will rearrange themselves to be close to the water because they're hydrophilic, they're polar, and they'll attempt to bury the hydrophobic residues inside the protein to restrict its access to water. Because remember, the polar things like polar, and non-polar things like dislike polar. So the non-polar things will attempt to exclude themselves from the polar solution as much as possible. So we know that hydrophobic interactions now is influenced heavily by polarity. So this is definitely a plausible answer. Hydrogen bonding. Now, hydrogen bonding has to do with electronegativity, which is another property you might remember from chemistry, and it deals with the property of hydrogen having a tendency to form weak bonds with electronegative elements such as oxygen or nitrogen. Now, this isn't really relating to polarity, so we can get rid of that. Van der Waals forces. Now, van der Waals forces are essentially, they have to do with certain atoms coming very, very close to each other and forming weak links as a result of that. And so that again has to do a little bit with like electron distribution between molecules that are very close to each other, and not as much influenced by the polarity of the surrounding environment in any way. So we know that van der Waals forces also is incorrect. Now, looking at these last two choices, ionic bonds and covalent bonds, these are types of bonds that are formed, they're very, very strong, and they're formed between, like, they're very strong bonds formed between components of a molecular compound. So ionic bonds is, for example, NaCl is very common between a sodium and a chloride. And then covalent bonds, this is very common in a carbon chain because two carbons like to bind to each other. But these bonds are extremely, extremely strong, and they're formed by, in the case of ionic, transfer of electrons, and in the case of covalent, shared electrons. And they're not influenced as much by the polarity. If you were to place molecules with ionic bonds or covalent bonds in a polar or nonpolar solution, those bonds aren't really going to be affected very much because they are so strong, and it would take a lot of, it would take a huge amount of change in the surrounding environment in order to influence these bonds. So polarity in this case would not directly influence the structure of either ionic bonds or covalent bonds, so we can kind of get rid of these. And so our only answer is A, hydrophobic interactions, and the reason is because when a certain protein is folding, the most important factor that is driven by a change in the polarity of the surrounding environment has to be through hydrophobic interactions or through the desire of polar residues to meet with the surrounding solution and the desire of nonpolar residues to exclude themselves from the polar solution. So that's why our answer here is A. Next question. A scientist administers varying levels of each of the following elements to test subjects and monitor their health. He observes that 4 of the elements can sustain the health of his subjects when present in minute quantities. However, one of the elements only sustains the health of his subjects when present in large quantities. Which of the following is most likely to be the identity of this element? So looking at, we have to again break down the information in the easiest way to know what we actually need. We know this statement is probably important. He says he observes that 4 of the elements can sustain the health of his subjects when present in minute quantities. So what that means is this is likely referring to trace elements. So if you remember about trace elements, they are essentially elements that you need in, elements needed in small quantities. For an organism to survive. And so we know that 4 of the elements are probably going to be trace elements, but the question is saying that one of the elements only sustains the health of his subjects when present in large quantities. Now think about it. Which of the following elements are present in large quantities? Chons plus P. So now finding the answer is as simple as looking for which of the following elements here is a part of the Chons plus P. So iodine, this is a trace element, so that's wrong. Nickel, trace element, that's wrong. Zinc, trace element, wrong. D, oxygen, is part of Chons plus P, so that's right. And then E, copper, is another trace element, so that's incorrect. So our answer is D. Our next question has to do with properties of water that are necessary for life. And so this question looks like it has a lot of information, and these definitely can be very daunting at first, but let's just do our best to kind of break it down. So Bob goes to his porch to sit outside in the middle of the day during peak summer. After a while, he decides to cool himself off and looks for a jug of water to pour on his face. Unfortunately, he realizes he doesn't have a jug of water and decides to use a jug of oil instead. To his surprise, the oil does nothing to cool him down. Which of the following is the most likely explanation? Now, this isn't necessarily the best question. Personally, I don't think this is a great question myself, but I think it's good to really practice on the questions where they give you a ton of information and you just kind of have to reason through it and use what you know to find the right answer. Because typically AP Bio questions aren't as simple as something like, which of the following is a property of water? Select it. They try and add a bunch of confusing information and you kind of have to use your best judgment to eliminate choices. Now let's look at the first choice. When sunlight hits oil molecules, they undergo an exothermic reaction and release heat into the body. Okay, now if oil molecules did undergo an exothermic reaction and released heat into the body, that would not cool him down. So an answer choice like this is seemingly plausible, but in retrospect, the fact that oil molecules, they don't really undergo much of a reaction when hitting sunlight. And so this is not really, you kind of just have to really understand the properties to know that this statement is just completely false. And so what they like to do a lot of times is they like to give you plausible answer choices that are, completely false. And you kind of have to use what you know about the properties of each of these things to interpret which of the following are completely false and which of the following are completely true. So we could say that, okay, maybe this is plausible. Let's look at the next choice. So the next choice says the heat of vaporization of oil is too high to allow for evaporative cooling. Unlike water, which has a high specific heat, ideal for evaporative cooling. Now, what we know about properties of water is we know that water does have a high specific heat, so we know that's true. And we know that water is essential in evaporative cooling because if you remember what this term means, if you think about when we sweat, when we exercise or whatever and we sweat a lot, the reason why sweat is able to cool us down is because the sweat or molecules of water are able to absorb large amounts of heat from the body and then evaporate. And so they essentially are able to leach heat from the body. And so evaporative cooling is a key mechanism by which water or sweat, I guess, is able to cool the body. And so this statement right here is definitely very logical. So we can leave that. Choice C. Oil particles strongly adhere to the skin and to each other, strongly coalescing to form a layer that traps heat in the body. In contrast, water has low surface tension and will not form this layer. Now, if oil did have strong surface tension and strong adhesion, like we could say, okay, that's plausible. It could form a layer that prevents heat from leaving the body because we know that the skin is a very common pathway for heat to leave the body. But it says here that water has a low surface tension. And we know that because of hydrogen bonding, water has a very, very high surface tension. So we know that this choice has to be completely wrong. So C is wrong. We know that. Now, choice D says nonpolar molecules such as oil are more adept at preventing heat loss than polar molecules, such as water. Now, this could also plausibly be true if we didn't know anything about it, but if you think about our definitions between nonpolar and polar, nonpolar means that the distribution of charge is equal, and polar means that the distribution of charge is unequal in a polar compound versus a nonpolar or a molecule in this case. And so we don't really, if you think about it, there's not really any real evidence that just because of this charge difference, it's going to be any more or less heat adept at preventing heat loss. So it's possible that this is true, but based on what we know about what the definitions of these things are, heat loss isn't really relevant to the definition at all, and so this is probably wrong. So we can kind of eliminate that just by kind of knowing what polar and nonpolar means. Choice E. The high viscosity of the oil interferes with the body's mechanism of releasing heat through the skin, whereas water enhances this mechanism. Now, if you know how sweat is able to cool the body down by absorbing heat and evaporating, you'll know that water doesn't really cool the body down by enhancing release of heat through the skin. It's not like you pour water on yourself and the water signals the body to release more heat. It's just that because we have these properties of water and water is able to absorb so much heat from the body, that's what allows the body to really cool down. So this water enhances this mechanism is wrong. So we can kind of automatically eliminate this. And so we're left between A and B. And so based on this point, this first one, if you don't know much about how oil really works, the fact that oil releases heat through an exothermic reaction, it is possible, but we're kind of able to see that the more likely answer here is B, right? Because we know that water has a high specific heat. We know that statement is correct. We know that water is engaged in evaporative cooling, and the heat of vaporization of oil is too high to allow for evaporative cooling. This kind of makes sense because if you think about oil, it's very viscous, it has a very high specific heat, and if you pour it on yourself, it's not really going to evaporate easily, right? Water will evaporate more easily, and so it does make sense that the heat of vaporization of oil is too high. And then we know based on our knowledge of properties of water that these statements are true, so the answer here is B. Our next question. A scientist isolates a macromolecule from a cell and notes that it is highly insoluble in water. So immediately you should think, my first thought when I hear this is it's probably going to be some sort of fat or lipid. And you kind of know this just because of knowing your properties. And we know that carbohydrates are very polar and like they dissolve easily in water. We know that proteins dissolve easily in water. And we know that nucleic acids dissolve easily in water. And so fats and lipids are immediately what you should think of when you hear an insoluble macromolecule. Now let's keep reading. Based on this information, choose the most likely identity of this molecule along with the most accurate description of its carbon structure. So we've already kind of identified from this first piece of information that it's going to be some sort of fat or lipid. So we can get rid of this, we can get rid of this, we can get rid of that. So notice, small pieces of information can easily help you eliminate stuff. So make sure you really try and go by process of elimination and try to eliminate until you find the best answer. So now we have two choices that say lipid. Now, this is kind of a more fact-based thing. You kind of have to know how lipids are structurally designed. And so our first choice here says lipid, carbons arranged in a ring. Now, there are structures in the body where the carbons are arranged in a ring. It looks something like this. But this is where becoming very familiar with structures of certain things really helps, because you'll know that this structure where carbon is arranged in a ring and you see groups like that, this is the common structure of a carbohydrate, not a lipid. Whereas in a lipid, if you remember, lipids have very long chains of carbon and hydrogen, so they look something like this. Each of these is a carbon, and you'll have lots of hydrogens branching off like that. So we know that C is wrong, and D says carbons are arranged as a long chain with many branching hydrogens, and so this is the correct answer. Question. You attempt to analyze the structure of a DNA molecule and discover that it consists of subunits containing a nitrogen base, a 5-carbon sugar, and a phosphate group. Now this makes sense because this structure right here is, if you know about how nucleotides make up nucleic acids, this right here is the basic structure of a nucleotide. And nucleotides combine to form polymers such as DNA or nucleic acids. So based on this information, which of the following is most likely to be true? A. DNA will dissolve in oil and other nonpolar substances. Well, we know that DNA has a phosphate group, so that's our functional group here, so phosphate group. And the chemical formula of a phosphate group is PO4 3-. So it is negatively charged. And because phosphate is negative, you should know that because we have an abundance of the negative charge as part of the phosphate group, that means that nucleotides must be polar. Because if you remember, polar molecules have an uneven distribution of charge, and if DNA did have, if the nucleotide did have an even distribution of charge, it would be very stable and no part of the molecule would be excessively charged. However, because we have a phosphate group here and it's going to be negatively charged, that means that we have an uneven distribution of charge and therefore the nucleotides must be polar. So we know A has to be wrong. B. DNA has an uneven distribution of charges due to the phosphate group. Now, if we think about that, right, uneven distribution of charges, that sounds right because that's literally the definition of polar substances. Due to the phosphate group, that's also right because that's where the molecule is predominantly negative. So this sounds like a good answer. C. DNA is only present in the nucleus of cells. Now this is where reading the question carefully is very useful, because if you know, if you just have a very good understanding of biology, you'll know automatically that this is false, because DNA is also found in certain organelles such as the mitochondria and chloroplasts, and also in many prokaryotic cells like bacteria. Those cells don't even have a nucleus, but they do have DNA. So if you know that you know this statement is automatically false. But even if you don't, Remember, the question said based on this information. And we know we've used the information for this previous choice to know that because it's a phosphate group, it has to have an uneven distribution of charge. But DNA is only present in the nucleus of cells. There is in no way anything in the information that could allow us to address this conclusion. So even if we don't know this fact, it has to be automatically wrong. This can also be seen in the next answer choice, because it says DNA was the first carrier of genetic information when life first formed. Now again, if you have a good understanding of biology, you'll probably know that DNA was not. It was scientists believe that it was most likely RNA that was the first carrier of genetic information. But even so, even if the statement was correct, like even if it said RNA, from no way from this information can we discern that conclusion, and so we can automatically rule that D is wrong. Finally, DNA is predominantly positively charged due to the presence of the phosphate group. We already know based on the chemical formula that it's negative, not positive, so E is wrong, and the last answer choice that we know has to be right is B. Next question. During a dehydration synthesis reaction, okay, so we know we're talking about dehydration synthesis here. So we know that we're going to have some sort of polymer, so like let's say A, B, and we have another sort of small, like let's say C, D, and we know that they're combining to form a bond. So we know that, let's say this has an OH group, this has an H group. These are going to combine to form a molecule of water, and we're going to end up with A, B, C, D. So this is the basic mechanism of dehydration synthesis. And so it says here there are 7 molecules of water that are produced. So this process happens 7 times. Now let's look here. So let's make this example even more simple for simplicity's sake. And so now that we know the basic format, let's make it even more simple. Let's just, or even better, we could just use this and model it out for the sake of the problem. So going back, it says 7 molecules of water are produced. So let's say that, let's model out as simple as possible. So let's just say, oops. Okay, so let's say that we have just A, and we're forming a bond with B. So OH, H, and we want to form a bond. And so in this case, let's assume that A and B are separate amino acids. So when we form a bond and we get A and B, and then this molecule of water is going to be released, right? How many, and in the question it says how many peptide bonds and how many amino acids are in the peptide chain. Well, when we have one H2O, right, released, how many peptide bonds do we have? We have 1 peptide bond and we have 2 amino acids, right? So now that we know this, we can almost label like a separate equation to model this. So we know that when for every 1 H2O, we get 1 peptide bond right? And we know that for every 1 H2O, we have 2 amino acids. So what this means is the number of peptide bonds equals the number of H2O released and the number of amino acids equals the number of H2O released plus 1, right? Because here it says 1 and 1, and then here for one H2O we have 2 amino acids. So for every H2O that's released, you have this peptide bond formed, and the peptide bond is formed between 2. So you'll always have one additional. And so let's say, for example, we had A, B, C that was formed. And so in the dehydration reaction, we'd have an H2O released here. We'd have an H2O released here. So H2O is released for each peptide bond. And we have 3 total amino acids with 2 peptide bonds. So our question says 7 molecules of water are produced. So we know that we have 7 peptide bonds. So automatically we can get rid of D, we can get rid of E, we can get rid of A. And for this, it says how many amino acids are in the peptide chain. Well, if we have 7 molecules of water, then 7 plus 1 equals 8. So we know our answer is C. Okay? Now our last. Select the answer choice that most accurately matches each macromolecule to its corresponding function. Okay, so questions like this, you really want to try and get right, because occasionally they're just going to throw you basic fact-based questions where you don't really have to sort through a lot of information, and you just have to know the information. So in this case, we know that our 4 macromolecules are proteins. I'm sorry guys, this is really bad handwriting. Let's see. So I'll write it maybe over here. So proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. Sorry about that. So we know these are our 4 main macromolecules. Now let's think about it, and let's just remind ourselves what each of these do, and from there it should be a relatively simple matter of solving the question. So what do proteins do? So when you first think of proteins, you can think, I have to eat lots of protein to build muscle. It's really important for constructing tissue. So we know that proteins are essential for building stuff, whether that be muscle, whether that be tissue, just things in the body. Proteins are used to build stuff, okay? So protein is building. That's my first thought. Carbohydrates. Well, if you remember, you'll probably learn later in this course. This doesn't come until later in the year. But carbohydrates, essentially, if you just think about it logically, or if you remember from honors biology, you'll typically, when cells are making energy, they break down molecules such as glucose to use in glycolysis, in the citric acid cycle, and in the electron transport chain. And so in general, carbohydrates are used as a source of energy in the body. And so we know that to some extent, carbohydrates are, energy, right? Nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are like DNA and RNA. And my first thought when it comes to nucleic acids is genetic information, because we know things like DNA are important for, transferring certain genes on from cell to cell. And then finally, lipids. My first thought of lipids is just fat in general. And the primary role of fat in animals is basically just to store energy. So if an animal is starving and it hasn't eaten for many days, then the body will start to break down the fat and use it as an additional source of energy. So lipids are like fat, so they store energy basically. Now let's look at the answer choices. A, proteins build tissues and organs. Okay, that sounds right. So this sounds okay. Lipids carry genetic information. Okay, we know automatically this is wrong because we know nucleic acids do that. So A is wrong. B, proteins used as main energy sources to make ATP. I mean, not really, right? I mean, proteins are used to build stuff, but they're not the source of energy used to build stuff. The body uses others. They can be, I guess, But they're not the main energy sources. Typically, the body likes to break down things like sugars first, and proteins are usually only as a last result if the animal is starving. And so this is probably wrong, but let's keep looking. Lipids carry genetic information. Okay, we know this is completely false, so B is also completely wrong. C, proteins, they carry genetic information. Okay, we know automatically that's completely wrong. You can look at the other choices, but typically what helps you go fast is if you're going through choices and you see one component that's automatically completely wrong, you can cross it out pretty fast. D, proteins, store energy in the body. Not really. I mean, they could potentially be sources of energy, but for the most part, it's not their main role. Lipids used as main energy source to make ATP. Again, not really. They can be used as energy sources, but typically the body will only resort to that again if the animal is starving. Nucleic acids carry genetic information. Yeah, that's true. Carbohydrates, they build tissues and organs. Okay, this is definitely incorrect because the body uses sugars mainly as a source of energy and they don't use it to build stuff like tissue. So we know that D has to be wrong. Now at this point, you don't even have to read the choice, but honestly I would recommend you still look through it just in case, sometimes you make a silly mistake, you accidentally overlook something. So we've already eliminated all the other choices, but let's go through this to double check. So proteins used to build tissues and organs, that's correct. Lipids store energy in the body as fat, so that's correct. Nucleic acids, they carry genetic information, that's correct. Carbohydrates used as main energy sources to make ATP, that's correct. So we know that E is our correct answer. So that's our last question, and I hope this video was helpful for you. The AP biology questions, of course, are going to be slightly different from this, but these hopefully are kind of a good conceptual review for you to make sure that you really understand the questions. I'd recommend you also check out other sources and Google for certain questions. Even in your textbook, for example, the chemobiology textbook is the most common textbook used for AP biology, and usually the end of chapter questions are a good content review. So I hope that these questions have helped you and have helped you gauge an understanding for how well you understand the material. And best of luck on your test for this unit and the AP exam as a whole. And thank you very much for watching again, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.